Babs. All good. Well, folks, welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. Not a brilliant day in Edinburgh, unfortunately, but we're used to it. This is our typical summer, I'm afraid. If you've been with us before, welcome back. If it's your first time, very warm welcome to you. For those of you who joining us for the first time, we do have a code of conduct. We ask simply that you be respectful to one another. We want everyone to have an enjoyable experience. We will do the community shout-outs at the end, and usual format for the Q&A. If you have any questions, please ask them as you go. Stick them in the chat, prefix them with a Q, makes it easy for the team and I to spot them, and then we'll relay them back to our wonderful speaker this evening. Steven Wendel joins us all the way from the States. I forgot where you're joining us from, Steve, but I'm sure you can do that when you introduce yourself in a minute. Steve's a behavioural scientist, and he's the head of behavioural science at Morningstar, and he's author of 3 books, most recently the one that he's going to be talking about, and giving us amazing insights into the work that he does in this space. And I can't wait to hear about the blueprint and how I might look to apply it. The floor is yours, Steve. Welcome.
All right. Thank you,
Good to have you here this evening.
Good to meet you all. And just for the record, he said that I had to abide by the code of conduct as well. So this will be a less colorful American presentation than normal, but I'll try my best to keep it interesting nevertheless. So everybody, as Sath mentioned, I am Steve Wendel. I do run the behavioral science team at Morningstar. That is my day job, where we run experiments to help people with their money. My night job is trying to build the community of behavioral scientists. I've been in the field for about 10 years now. Started a nonprofit that educates people about these issues, and recently came out with a book that was both the product of our own work and just the lessons from many other people in the field, and a great opportunity to learn from so many other great folks. And I want to share that with you today. And I thought I'd start with just a little definition. For those of you who aren't familiar with behavioral science is, it's an interdisciplinary field. It's one that's really can say started about 25, 30 years ago, and has grown rapidly, especially in the last 10 years, building on psychology and economics. And our goal, very explicitly, is to change behavior, to understand where people make what seem to be mistakes, seem to do things that are irrational, and to help them change that. And this is very different than most other fields. Most other academic fields are particularly focused on an understanding of the mind, or, right, building a product or doing efficient, robust software. We are focused on one very narrow thing, and that is behavior change and how to do it well. And so I mentioned this growth over the last 10 years. Now we see across the world, companies of all stripes are applying behavioral science. And I just put a few examples here from large companies like your Walmart, your Facebook, your Amazon, etc., tiny nonprofits, big healthcare companies, consulting groups, Weight Watchers, the UK government, lots of other organizations all around the world. And this has been just explosive growth in the past few years. And I thought it's useful just to give an example of what this means in practice. So here's an example from the Uber behavioral science team, where Uber had this problem in which, well, people were using Uber Pool, people were waiting for a ride, and they were getting terribly frustrated, saying, "Where's my ride? Where's my ride? Come on, what's going on here?" And so the behavioral team was embedded in data science. Okay, and so on the data science side, the head of data science spent a lot of time looking at how to make the algorithm more efficient, how to cut the waiting time by finding the exact right path between one person and the next to make it as fast as possible. The behavioral science team said, "Oh, wait a minute. There's only so far you can get with that. Why don't you just help people not be frustrated? Why don't you just tell people what you're doing?" It's a technique called the labor illusion. It's a terrible name for something that's actually quite straightforward. Originally came from Harvard in work with Kayak and other companies like that, where they found that if you simply tell people why they're waiting, what's going on during that time, they're far less frustrated. Now, Uber has done a great many other bad things in the world, But this was an example where the behavioral science team did a very smart, cost-effective, simple way to solve a problem. And that is what we find again and again in behavioral science, is that there are often simple, cost-effective ways to help people do better, in this case, not be so frustrated, to experience their products better, to be more likely to exercise, to speak in language, whatever it might be. If we just understand the fundamental psychology of what's going on and what that means for the interface and the types of choices people make. And as we look across these companies, as I mentioned, I really had the joy and the luck to speak to so many different groups around the world, is that we find that in many ways we've coalesced on a common blueprint of how we do this stuff. And so I wanted to share that blueprint with you. I'll talk a little bit more about what is behavioral science, just give a bit more grounding. But I particularly want to share that blueprint with you. And I want to talk about, at least how I see, opportunities in project management, opportunities in working with product teams. And I mean, my arena is research, working with product teams, and working with marketing. And I'll speak to some of those opportunities as well. Now, there is time for Q&A at the end, but there's no reason to wait for that. So as my kids and my wife will tell you, I can and will talk about these topics for 7-8 hours on end without a break. So there's a tremendous amount of really cool stuff out there, and I'd much rather pick the parts that you're interested in than for me to give a canned talk. So feel free to ask questions throughout. I'll particularly stop and look at each of these section breaks, but feel free to ask anytime, right? You can either raise your voice, ask a question, or type something into the chat window. It's much more interesting when it's interactive. Deal? Okay, all right, I saw some thumbs. That's good.
Already, but it might preempt a lot of what you're going to say. So I was going to
Bring it on, man. Bring it on.
So the first was that, do you prescribe language to use as well? But I'm sure you're going to go on to explain exactly how the blueprint works and what you do and what you don't do. So
language in what way? As in the language that the user might see, or how we talk about this? What do you mean specifically?
I don't know, Liz, happy for you to unmute and ask your question? Or
oh, sorry. Yes, I didn't. I thought that was your question, Sath.
No. I just saw a couple appear in the chat just because you were about to start. I thought, why not just get a couple of them in there?
Yeah, no, bring it. Okay,
so
sorry,
language, Steve, language that you might use, or you would advise the company or the client to use to then help the behavior.
Absolutely. And in fact, often those small efficient changes are talking about the action, talking about the decision in a different way. And I'll give a lot of examples. We call that part of the framing, how you describe it, or the choice architecture, the particular choices that you give that have a surprisingly large effect on people's behavior. So I'm happy to, so I'll share some of those examples along the way. And I'll also tell you where it's not, where we know the language is important, but we don't necessarily know what the right language is. And that's part of the approach that I'll talk about. And then also just to answer David Crow's question about, is there a free copy of the book to poor PhD students? Yes, absolutely. Yes, just send me an email. So I have the digital copy of the book, which between you and me, we just won't tell O'Reilly that I'm sending out to people who can't afford the book. So O'Reilly's my publisher. Okay. So great. And I just lost the window here. I just want to bring that back so I can see folks talking. Sorry. Okay. Can you guys still see the slides? I can't actually see you because I seem to have
You're good, Steve. You're good. You're good.
Okay, cool. So I can't see the thumbs anymore, but I will go through the rest. So let's talk about that behavioral science, and I'll give you an example. Let me dive in a bit more. So you may have seen books like Nudge, Predictably Irrational. The UK government's Nudge unit has done some awesome work in the field, and that's useful. But I want to give you a somewhat different understanding. I want to talk about how we develop the lessons that go into those books, because the process, actually applying it, is quite different than what you get in the reading of it. Now, I like to use the example of exercise, and that is because this is an area that, in my various discussions with people around the world, there doesn't seem to be a place where this situation doesn't occur. So I'm sure many of you, like myself, have maybe a gym membership before the pandemic, or exercise equipment at home, or a floor that we really intended to, that we really want to just do push-ups on, or running shoes, or whatever it might be. And we absolutely intended to use it, right? That's why we spent the money on the shoes, on the gym, on the exercise equipment, whatever it might be. But yet, we didn't quite follow through and actually do it, right? And so, from what I've seen, that's a pretty common problem, right? It's not because we, and I do say the we because I'm absolutely included in this as well. It's not because we lack motivation, right? We obviously had motivation or we wouldn't have spent the money. It's not because we don't get the value proposition of the product, to put it in product development terms, right? And it's not because we didn't sincerely believe. It's something else goes wrong. And that what goes wrong is in our heads. What goes wrong is, well, a gap between our intentions and our actions, the things that we sincerely and absolutely want to do and believe that we will do, and what actually happens in real life. Now, I'm an American. I've only been to Edinburgh once, much to my shame, but I'm reasonably sure that people all around the world say this. And yes, by the way, I blame Netflix too. We're actually going to talk specifically about Netflix and how they're involved. Thank you, Indrajit. So that's the gap, right? And this gap occurs in exercise. It occurs in maybe finishing up a report. It occurs in healthy eating. It occurs in just about everything of our lives. And so behavioral scientists study why that happens. And so we can come to some obvious and clear answers, right? That you're distracted by something else, like Netflix, right? That you are, that you're lacking, that you were busy doing something else, or maybe you forgot to go, etc., right? And this is really easy for us to find these answers when it comes to ourselves. But yet, when we're building our products, we don't realize that. And so, as behavioral scientists, we look and see what drives that. What drives the forgetfulness, the giving into temptation, the watching Netflix, etc. And this is where you get biases, if you've heard that term, or heuristics, which are the shortcuts that our mind use to make decisions. So, for example, one reason that people may spend so much time watching Netflix is because, I don't know if this is popular in Scotland right now, but because they heard all of their friends talking about the Tiger King, which is an absolutely awful show, by the way. Don't go watch that. And so they said, oh, okay, well, hey, other people are doing this. That seems like a good idea. I'm going to go watch Netflix. I'm going to go watch the Tiger King. And the exercise got pushed off. We call that herding behavior, right? People taking a signal from each other and then doing the same thing. It might, for example, be what we call temporal myopia, or present bias, which is exercise is awesome in that it helps you, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line, not have a heart attack, or not have back pain, like I have, etc. The challenge is that's a long time away. And we're wired to naturally focus more on the present, right? We look at the challenges in front of us. We look at the opportunities in front of us and the near-term costs and benefits, even to the detriment of something that can help us immensely in the long term. And so we call that present bias, or temporal myopia, short-sightedness in time. Now, there are many, many such biases, and I'll talk about a few more of them as we go along. But the point is that behavioral scientists, we start to dig in and understand why we have that gap. Again, the we, because it's not about them, it's about us. And one of those challenges that we find is that we have a blind spot. It's called the fundamental attribution bias, which is that we're easily able to excuse away our own problems. But when it comes to other people, in the product context, our users, well, they just must not like the product, or there's something wrong with them. They just don't get the menu. Are they crazy? Why don't they get this awesome product that we've developed? That we judge other people by a very different standard than we do ourselves. And so we look at that and say, what can we do about this? And as behavioral scientists, that's the core of our work. So you think of it as really three parts, is what applied behavioral science is. And you only get a little bit of this in the books like Nudge and Particularly Irrational, because they're exciting. They talk about the results, but not the process. So first we have that understanding of the mind, a compendium of biases, and more importantly, the underlying reason why our biases exist and how they help us in many ways before they go awry. Second is a set of tools, interventions, or ways of changing an environment, like changing language, as a person had asked about before, to help people do better, to make better decisions, to make better choices and actions. And then finally, deep at the core of behavioral science is an understanding that this stuff is bloody hard, and that changing behavior, you should always assume that you're not able to do it, that you're not going to have any effect, and that you have to measure always to see, is it actually working? Is it backfiring? Is it working for the people that I thought or some other group? And while I think about it in the product context of who we're trying to serve, the same also occurs, of course, in our product development. And so we're going to talk about that as well, which is why might there be a gap between an engineer who says that, and I was a software engineer in the past, who says, oh yeah, I'm going to develop this product, and oh yeah, I can build this thing in 2 weeks. And about two months and 2 weeks later, you're still wondering, what's going on here, right? This is a human problem. It's not a problem of those other people out there, right? And so I want to just take a quick pause. I want to look through the questions, and I want to see if that context setting made sense before we dive into the details of how you actually do this stuff in practice. So I will take a strategic drink while I read some questions.
You've got one, Steve.
Yes.
Earlier on, it was just around clarification of whether you were describing something similar to executive dysfunction in neurotypical contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we find is that the mind is wired in a surprisingly similar way. Now, let me give a little bit of that. I mentioned that there's an underlying foundation for why people have these, why we have this intention-action gap. It's fundamentally because we're limited beings. Now, some people in particular areas may be limited in different ways, right? I have never been very good at sports, right? Other people might not be good at a particular type of mathematical problem. We differ, but fundamentally the constraints that we're all under are there, which is we all have limited memory, regardless of the level which we have memory. We all have limited attention. We all have limited mathematical abilities, again, with a variation between. And because of that, our minds take shortcuts in order to make quick decisions. And so sometimes those shortcuts are great, right? They help us, for example, if you're in a theater and you hear lots of people screaming and running out, you don't really worry about why they're screaming. You take that as a quick cue to get out yourself. That is an example of herding behavior that helps us. It's just in certain contexts they go awry. And so there hasn't been, to the best of my knowledge, detailed research on neuroatypical folks. But from what we've seen across the sweep of humanity, these issues do arise again and again because they're fundamental about our limitations as human beings. So I hope that helps. So it's not an executive dysfunction. It's just fundamentally that we can't consider all possible options in the blink of an eye. I hope that helps. There's a question about buying exercise equipment. So buying exercise equipment is a short-term win, right? And the brain optimizes for this. You see the quick reward of purchase, and you don't actually take action. Exactly. That is temporal myopia in a nutshell, in that we focus on, okay, what is the short-term win, with actually not necessarily taking the actions to get the long-term benefit, even though the long-term benefit of exercise far exceeds the momentary joy that you may get from the purchase, okay? And then finally, just one other question before we continue, and please keep them coming. We'll take a break over the next, before the next section as well. Do we have a single mind or series of heuristics and reflexes? That is a great question. So short answer is it's very complicated. but the longer answer is many behavioral economists, behavioral scientists simplify how the mind works by describing it as two systems, right? One system is your deliberative, thoughtful, okay, I'm going to choose whether or not to buy this house. I'm going to choose whether I take this job or not, right? Where you're consciously thinking very carefully about pros and cons. And the other side is what's known as our system one. That's where where it is an intuitive emotional reaction. It's our fast thinking. It occurs in a blink of an eye. And I'll talk a lot more about that shortly. Now, within each of them, there are lots of shortcuts that our minds use. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. And then finally, we are just leaves in the wind of causality. Excellent. I've always found that to be a bit too depressing, so I've avoided that myself. There's just somebody making existential comment about our ability to make free choice. Hey, there you go. Okay, so let's talk about that blueprint for deciding, and what does it actually mean to actually apply this stuff in practice. Okay, and again, keep the questions coming. So I mentioned that recently came out the book. As part of the book, I worked with the nonprofit that I founded and another group in the field to survey teams all around the world. We actually had about 40% of all known teams in existence around the world fill out this detailed survey that talked about what they do, the challenges they face, etc. It was a wonderful show of the community. And so what I'll be sharing comes from that and from the subsequent interviews and discussions with the various groups. And looking across the range of different approaches, whether as a designer, it might be the UK's Design Council's Double Diamond, whether it may be Ideas 42, which has a great system of understand, diagnose, design, whether it might be Walmart, which has a system called the 4Ds. When you look at what each of them involve from a behavioral perspective, we're all fundamentally doing the same thing, which is a type of behavioral problem solving, or an applied version of the scientific method, which is, first and foremost, we try and understand what are we trying to accomplish, right? Now, in a product context, that's what the product is intending to deliver. But I also want to say that we apply this same thing to work environments as well. So if you're a project manager, a scrum master, etc., we follow the same process when we're looking at, for example, what is the team trying to accomplish? What is the challenge that we're facing as a team that we want to overcome? That's the definition. But that's what we want. Then we explore the context. We look at the people we're trying to help, whether that be our teammates or whether it be users of our product, and say, what's realistic in their environment? What's going on for them? What do they want? What are their preferences? We look at the intersection of the two and see if we can ethically help people, right? Is there an intersection between what they want and what we want and what's possible? We then, given that understanding, craft an intervention. We take from the behavioral toolkit and say, here's a way that we can help. Now, that at first is just an idea. We then work on the implementation. There are challenges like any product development process. There are always challenges to that implementation, which we'll talk a bit about. And then finally, because we know that behavior change is hard, again, whether it be with our teammates or whether it be with our users, we always have to measure. Different ways of measuring, but we look to see, were we right? Did this actually help, or did it make things worse or have no effect? And then from that, we evaluate the next steps. Now, there are a variety of different frameworks, as I mentioned, that you can use. Decide is just how I summarize it. It's really, in itself, nothing special. And I'll be perfectly frank about that. If you have another framework, that's great. You can integrate this. What really matters from behavioral science isn't the acronym. It is the tools that we use along the way. It's how we fine-tune that problem so it is something that can actually be attacked. It is how we understand the obstacles, the behavioral obstacles, how we talk about the ethical challenges of behavior change. And so today we're going to go through some of those tools. Now, I can't go through all of them. It's because there's just a tremendous richness there. But I do, however, have a workbook that you can use. It gives a little bit of theory, gives a little background about how this stuff works. And then it's 25 pages of, here's a situation, here's what you do. Here's a situation, here's what you do, in a template format. And it actually comes from the workbook that I used on my own team. at first at a company called Held Wallet, and then now at Morningstar. It's also completely free, by the way. So please check it out. You can get it at behavioraltechnology.com. So let's apply this framework using a practical problem. Now, again, I love to use exercise because it is so commonly a problem we all face. But you can think of a problem that your team faces. You can think of a problem that your users face. Okay, and so let's, for my example and for my part, I'll start with this example of exercise, right? And you've been asked, your team has been asked to go build an application that helps people get off their lazy butts and go exercise. Let's say, for the sake of argument, it's going to the gym. You say, okay, I need some more information there. Now, generally, one would get a design brief or a functional spec that describes, okay, it's going to be a mobile app. These are our types of users. This is the time frame, etc. What we want to make sure is that that definition of the problem includes 3 important behavioral aspects. Okay, the first one is, well, actor, who exactly are we trying to help? Action, what do we believe is necessary for them to do? And then outcome, what's the benefit for them, not just for us, right? And so, for example, in this case, it might be helping white-collar workers, like myself, get off my lazy ass and go exercise at the gym. In order to, maybe it's decrease weight, maybe it's to have less back pain, less neck pain, whatever it might be. I'm sure many of you who are stuck at home and spending a lot of time in front of the computer like this, sadly are probably experiencing that as well right now, because it is a pretty common problem for our field. So, and that's important. Now, some of you who have worked in this field a while may say, but wait a minute. You just said, okay, the outcome is going to the gym. I'm sure there are probably lots of other ways that you could help people have less joint pain, lose weight, etc. And you're exactly right. Now, this is, this actually isn't a topic that I usually give in my overviews, but I knew that you'd be an audience for which this could have a more discerning eye. And I wanted to give a bit more of a logic there. So there's a challenge when we write out what we want to accomplish, okay, like this. Sometimes it's just given. Sometimes the boss, etc., says, okay, this is what we're going to do, and you don't have a say in it. But often we can, and we have to be aware of what's known as availability bias, okay, which is the things that come to mind, let's say, to help people exercise or to help your team be more efficient. If it's a hard problem, if it's something that people have been working on for a while, then what comes to mind easily is probably wrong. The obvious thing is our enemy, and it's because our minds are tricking us. Our minds conflate the things that come to mind quickly with the things that are true. But the problem is, there's a different reason things come to mind quickly. It's because it's often thought about. You can think of it as digging a path in your brain, that you're creating a rut. And that rut makes it a whole lot easier to travel along that path, right? It comes very quickly. But if you're facing a hard problem and you're being called in to try and fix it, well, wherever that rut is, it's clearly not working. And so we need tools that break us out of the obvious. And so there are a variety of different ways of divergent thinking techniques out there. In the workbook, you'll find one if you're not familiar with these. And this one is to write out that obvious, because you can't get it out of your mind, right? It's very hard to work around. But to write that out and then force yourself to think of, for example, a radical persona, a very different type of user, or peripheral type of user, or think of 4 different actions that someone might take to force yourself out of the obvious. And then you have a prioritization technique. Now, I'm personally a fan of Edward de Bono, who coined the term, yes, that's right, very compatible with red team, blue team thinking, as well as Edward de Bono, who is one of my favorite folks in the field, not in behavioral science, but in creative thinking. He used the idea of different hats, thinking hats, as well as random association techniques to help you break out of the obvious. Okay, so let's say that you've settled on that. You've settled, and for the sake of argument, let's say that you've settled on the exercise route to help people lose weight and not have to go to the doctor. So that's what you want. Let's talk about what's going on with your users. or again, what's going on with your teammates. So if you work with designers, if you're a designer yourself, you've probably come across the idea of a journey map, okay? Where you write out the journey that a person takes. Here, we're going to do a behavioral version of that. And if you're not familiar with it, that's fine. I'm going to explain. What we want to do is we want to look at each of the individual micro behaviors, the tiny steps that a person takes between what they're doing right now and this final outcome. And so let's say, for example, we wanted to look at what happens between someone sitting on their tuchus at home and going out to the gym. And by the way, I use a variety of strange slang from around the world. My apologies if some of them make no sense. They don't make any sense to my team either. So I just get used to it. So how do you get people off their tuchus and going to the gym? So, well, let's think about it. So now this was a B2B context. So let's just say you're working in B2B, you give this mobile app is for, it's sold to companies and then they provide it to their employees. Okay, so how is it going to be effective? Well, let's see. You're going to send them an email about the app. They're going to have to open the email. They're going to have to download the app. They're going to have to create an account. They're going to have to, well, yeah, but they're probably not exercising right then. So they have to turn on notifications. Who turns on notifications by default anymore, right? That's not very common. And so, and then either they're gonna have to see that notification at a time when they could exercise or open their email, right, and not be watching Netflix. Netflix is very common. I use it throughout the talks usually. And then, oh yeah, well, if they get the notification, then they have to pay attention to it. They have to not be doing something else at the time. They have to, they have to have the gym clothes and they have to be clean. They have to have their shoes. So let's say if they're going running there, they have to know where to go to the gym. They have to have gas in the car. They have to have the membership. A tremendous amount of steps, tremendous number of steps are involved. And generally when I do this with people, right, when I do this with companies or individual teams, they say, oh my Lord, that's overwhelming. And that's exactly the point. Again, our minds trick us here. If it's a path that we're familiar with, like, hey, why don't you just estimate your stories for the next sprint, right? For those of us who are familiar with, it just seems so easy, right? There are a couple big ideas that we organize this around. Okay, you need to think, what are the priorities? What are the major actions? Okay, what's the relative amount of time? Great, 3 big things, no problem, just go do it. But to your user, to your teammate, it's a very different thing. And so we write out those micro behaviors to break out of our minds and get a sense of what's really happening in their lives, right? And we often find it's just tremendously more complicated than we assume as the experts, right? And so that's step number 1, is writing out all those micro behaviors. Step number 2 is to figure out where things might go awry. And we have a framework to help you think about the main behavioral obstacles, okay? And that is, in order for someone to take conscious action, there are 6 things that need to be in place. First is, I'm actually gonna close the chat. I see lots of discussion there. Thank you all. But I wanna make sure I can give this story. So I'll come back to it shortly as well. There's 6 things that need to happen. First, you need to get their attention. Something needs to cue them to the action, which is often your biggest problem, because they have jobs, they have kids, they have Netflix, they have other things in their lives that they're focused on. And getting their attention is often the hardest part, and it's the one that we assume away. Well, our product's awesome, of course they're gonna do it. Or our team, right? This process is clear, why don't they just do it? It's because they're not thinking about it. Second, once the mind starts thinking about an action, then there's an immediate reaction. That's your system 1 response that I mentioned before, of the fast thinking, your intuitive emotional response. If they don't immediately discard the idea, then we have the conscious cost-benefit analysis. And the thing to remember here is that we aren't computers. We don't do a mathematical analysis of costs and benefits, but rather our minds warp that sense. I mentioned one of them is our temporal myopia, our focus on present benefits instead of long-term benefits, but there are many more ways in which that's warped. We look at the ability. Can we actually take this action, and do we feel confident about it? right? Do we have a sense of what's known as self-efficacy, Bandura's work and others? And finally, we have two issues, or timing, or the sense of urgency, and the wonderful ability we all have to procrastinate. And then, even if these things in general seem good, our past experience can taint any one of these. If you've had, for example, somebody who has worked in an extreme programming shop, it's one of the, I don't know if that's one of the techniques y'all use. It's one that I've used in my past, or an agile shop, or some other version of this. And they were burned by it. It just didn't work well for them, or it wasn't well explained, or it didn't resonate, and it didn't quite gel as a team. They'll be so much less likely to listen, regardless of the benefits, regardless of how useful it would be for them, even how easy it is, because of that past experience. And so the good news is that as behavioral scientists, we have lots of tools to help. So we look at each of these micro behaviors and we say, okay, at this step, let's say downloading the app, did you have their attention? Well, if they just opened the email, yes. What is their emotional reaction? Maybe it's, oh God, another dang gym app. There was somebody in the comments who just mentioned that their gym app was terrible, right? And so they're like, nope, not gonna do this. Was it an issue of the costs and benefits, right? And so we diagnose the particular behavioral problem at those steps. And again, we use this both for product development and we use it in HR or in interpersonal context as well, as we try to think of where someone might struggle, what's going on in their lives beyond what I'm trying to accomplish. Now, once you've gotten that diagnosis, you know what's going on, then we look at the intervention. And there are a tremendous number of these, and they're mapped to each of these different obstacles, based on cue, based on reaction, etc. We have techniques that can help when you're looking to start an action, like to get someone's attention, to handle a strong negative emotional reaction, to help them, say, for example, go exercise. And we also have techniques to help people stop. Smoking, for example, has recently been found to be primarily a habit, not an addiction, which is, it's a behavioral response. It's something we can change. It's not just a nicotine addiction that is very difficult to overcome. We have to understand the mechanics of the habit, and we can use these techniques, as actually they are used in smoking cessation, to help overcome that. So let me just give you a few quick examples, and then we'll start wrapping up. So, okay, on the cue side, so if you don't have people's attention, what do? Well, you communicate with them somehow. Now, this is an example of a randomized control trial that I ran with one of the largest employers in the world. And this one was large minimum wage population. We sent emails to them, and what we found is that there is a huge difference in how people responded just on the time of day. This is a few of the examples. We actually did dozens of different types. And the responsiveness for the exact same message, the exact same content, same language, same sender, etc., varied by a swing of 75%, just by when you did it. And I've repeated this with many other companies and organizations. And we see that again and again. It's not, by the way, that Sunday is always the best time. It's rather, we have to understand the structure of people's time, when they have the bandwidth to listen to us. If, for example, we set a meeting with our team at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, the content may be great, but they may be overwhelmed by their inbox and all the things that they're thinking about they need to do. And so rather than try and clear all that way and say, pay attention, instead, we look to, how do we have sympathy for their limited bandwidth and say, what are the opportunities we have in order to communicate with people effectively? When do we speak at the time that they can listen? Now, let's talk about the emotional reaction and what might happen to your users, to your teammates, etc., in a particular moment. And there are many, many techniques here. One of them is, and I alluded to this before, is to simply show what other people are doing, right? We see that in herding behavior. We also see it in a way that can help people. The image on the left comes from a company called OPAP, which sends out physical mailers, right? Pieces of mail to people saying how much they're spending on electricity or gas or other utilities and how much their neighbors are. And they found in randomized control trials by Hunt, Alcott, and others that this motivated people to change. That they saw that their neighbors were spending less and like, wow, okay, so first of all, I don't want my neighbors judging me that I'm spending more. Now they don't actually provide that information, but it's a psychological mechanism. And then second, oh, if they're doing it, well, I have to as well. Now, I've been in this field for years. When I get this, and I do get this, I get this mail from Willpower, burns my blood, drives me crazy. I know exactly what it's about, but it's such a powerful mechanism that it is quite motivating. The one on the left is just an experiment I ran in a finance context, where it's also very effective. There's many, many uses of this in different examples. The point is that people look to see what their peers are doing, and that's a very powerful signal of what we ourselves should do. Here's a fun one, which comes from the realm of savings. Hal Hirschfield at UCLA, Dan Goldstein at Microsoft, and others, they wanted to help people save, and they found that, well, saving for retirement in this case. Retirement is so often in the future, people just don't get it. Like, okay, yeah, I know I need to save. But when you show them an age-progressed version of their face, they're like, oh my God, that's me. And they connect with that person. They connect with their future selves in a more real way. And they're more likely to save, more likely to take that action. Again, it's an emotional reaction. Now, on the evaluation side, generally we're very good at talking about our costs and benefits, but one way you can get around this temporal myopia, right, the focus on the present, is to bundle together something that's short-term and something that's long-term. So Katie Milkman at Wharton did this. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, not sure if you saw my my 9-year-old in the background there who's coming in to chat. He's a great guy. So what they did was they bundled together, in this case, exercise, a long-term benefit, with an audiobook, something that people wanted right now. It had recently come out, people were excited about it, and so they locked this audiobook in the gym lockers, and that's the only place people could get it, and they couldn't come out with it. And by bundling together a short-term want with a long-term one, they found that they could, well, help support that longer term gain for the individual. Okay, this is an example that actually a member of my team did, which was about email opt-ins. In this case, people often have a strong emotional response to, would you like information? They say, no, absolutely not. He knew that some people actually did want it and some people didn't. And so he slowed them down and just switched from that emotional reaction to a conscious, deliberative one, by making it a little bit unfamiliar and giving a bit more text, which is of course exactly against what you generally hear in product design. Remove all friction, make things easy. Not necessarily. No, this is actually a case where adding friction is quite useful and helpful for the person. And so this is, he made it into a drop down, and we had a tremendous effect from this. Just by avoiding that quick emotional response and letting people think about it, we had a 500% increase in opt-ins. Amazing. Now, there are lots of other techniques out there. I don't have time to talk about them all today, sorry. But I do want to spend a little bit of time, and I've hinted a bit, yeah, Mackenzie does use that, in fact. Thanks, Liz. So I've talked about a few of them. You'll find more within the workbook. But I want to move on and dive in a bit more in detail into the process of using this in project management, using this with your teams. Now, I've hinted at some of those along the way, but I want to just point out a few specific areas that can help. Let me also just check the chat window and take a drink of water. Satha, there's some particular questions. I see there are quite a lot here. I don't know if I can actually go through all of this.
Not all questions, Steve. A lot of it's just, yeah, chat amongst our wonderful community.
Okay, well, hey, I'm glad folks are engaged.
Let me find you a question. There was a couple in there.
Okay. Okay, so someone talking, oh, actually you were talking about habit versus addiction.
Yeah, somebody asked questions. I mean, it was asking, yeah, is there a discernible difference in habit and addiction?
Yeah, so I use it in the particular scientific sense, right, that we use in the community, which is a habit is an automatic behavior. It is something that when you see a cue, when you see something in the environment, you automatically take action. So for some of us, that might be walking past the coffee shop, smelling the coffee, going in and buying the coffee, starting to drink it before we even think about anything, right? Cue to action is habit. Exactly. Thank you, David. An addiction is a chemical dependency in the brain. And they are really, really quite different, even though sometimes they express themselves similarly. So, in fact, in many ways, they are polar opposites. A habit involves no thought and no feeling. It is actually our mind's way of freeing up your conscious faculties to think about something else. For example, when you're driving, when you're biking, that's an example of habits at work. It allows you to think about that asshole who just cut you off, or this report you have to do, rather than the minute muscle movements that you need to control your foot or your arms as you're driving or biking. That's a habit. An addiction is something you feel. You feel that lack because it's a chemical dependency in the brain. So they're actually quite different, even if sometimes they express themselves similarly. And so that's why it's so important that smoking is in fact a habit, because we can deal with it with a very different set of tools. So anyway, I hope that was probably more than you were looking for, but it's a fascinating topic.
No,
So,
that was great.
So David says ethics. About ethics, yes.
Yeah, scrolling
Please.
further up. So I thought you might want to touch on that, because I know we talked about that before, and I think it's a really important aspect of all of this. So
Absolutely, yeah. So I do talk about that a bit shortly, but sure. What's your question?
it's quite lengthy, but if you're going to talk about it later, I can hold it off if you want me to. It's just around basically techniques. So ethics using these techniques without the consent of users. So yeah, something we've all probably talked about.
So that one's simple. Don't do it.
Yeah.
I know that's disappointing for a lot of people, right? They think, behavioral science, I can go make people do what I want. I can make things work. I have this grand vision about how my team should work, how my product should work, how the world should work. Bullshit. No, thankfully, none of us have that power, even if we try to reach for it.
So are you saying if you're a Jedi, don't use Jedi mind tricks?
No, it's not. It's not that. It's a little more subtle than that. There aren't any such Jedi mind tricks. Rather, there are tools we have that can make things easier for people, right? And we should absolutely use them with the consent of the person. And that's not a question. But that it's very hard to force people to do something without a gun. And that's a good thing. I'm glad. And second, to the extent that we can, there are dark patterns. There are techniques to trick people. They're often not in the big behavior change. They're in small things like giving your credit card number, giving permission to data, etc. Smaller actions. There are ways to trick people. And why would we do that when there's so many good ways that we can help people and that we can find a natural alignment between what we want and what they want? And that's one reason why I use Leon. He's the person on my team's example. Yeah, there are a tremendous number of ways that marketers and companies trick folks into giving their personal data. But if you just stop and you think for a second, what is it that my users want? How can I give it to them better? That's a much better foundation for relationship between your company and your users, or you and your team members, or etc., whoever you might be applying this. And so I make a point to tell people exactly what I'm doing. We post it on our website. We post papers about this. We leave nothing. We don't hide any of that, right? Because one, it creates a social commitment for us, right? So people know what we're doing. They're probably going to watch us more carefully. And second, I don't want to rely on trickery, right? I don't want people to trick me. And so I would never recommend that to somebody else, right? I think the golden rule is a great place to start here. So I hope that speaks to some of the questions.
It does actually answers a few, because a lot of the earlier ones I was sifting back through them were all kind of related to that. You know, you could obviously use that for bad rather than, for good, and clearly not really want to be doing that. But it's
absolutely right. And to be fair, people have been tricking each other for a very long time. It's not, behavioral science didn't create that. But we do have some ways that can help fix it, which is what I want to talk about next.
Right.
So maybe I'll switch over. How are we doing on time?
You're great. Plenty of time.
Okay, cool. Just checking. And let me actually see. I have another. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Oh yeah. Okay, I'm good. I've got lots of time. Sorry. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about those opportunities. We will talk ethically, and we'll also talk about some opportunities in dealing with working with teams as well. And then we'll have more time for open questions. I'm free until 2:30 my time. It's about 35 minutes from now. And I'm happy to stay on as long as y'all have questions. So I will have to turn on a fan. It's gotten remarkably hot in here right now. There we go. Hopefully that doesn't leave too much background noise for y'all. So, okay. So what are some opportunities that we have in applying behavioral science? Now, one of them is very, very obvious, which is you can use this in the context that I've just given, which is to understand and help your users, to build better products, to build better marketing, right? And those are the main areas in which we see this. We see it in design, product management, marketing, and in some cases, the engineering, the project management that goes with that, right? So I'm not going to talk more about that opportunity, but that's an obvious place where you can use this. But you can also use this to help change the process by which you build, and not just in terms of behavior change of our users, but rather to become more data-driven. And that's because part of this process is very explicitly about setting clear behavioral outcomes. Now, this is probably old hat to y'all, but for most of the audiences I talk with, they don't set clear objectives. They don't actually have a conversation with their boss about what the product is supposed to accomplish in any clear and measurable way. And as you all probably know, you're very unlikely to hit a target if you don't know where it is, if you haven't set that. And so part of this process, especially in the beginning, is talking in an upfront and clear manner. What is the actual outcome we're trying to drive? Why is this important for the user? Why is this important for us? And what is the action we think will accomplish this? And then to problematize that, to raise it and say, hey, that just doesn't seem right. This doesn't seem like the effective way to accomplish this. And so there you go, right? That's one part of this. This is a tool to do good product planning, if nothing else. Because in the end, almost all products are only going to be successful when the people using them are, well, if they are changing their behavior, right? Almost all products effectively require a behavior change, right? Using a new app, using a new feature, that's a change. Because of that feature, going on exercising, because of that feature, going out and using a new accounting technique, whatever it might be. All of those are behavior change. And so this initial behavioral brief can help the overall project get in a firmer place. Okay. Second, I mentioned this commitment to testing our impact, right? And that's because we know that this stuff is hard, but there's a side effect from that, which is it means that we start getting very, very rigorous measurements about impact and ROI as a side effect. And when we start seeing that, when we start measuring the impact, whether the change happened to be behavioral, whether it happened to be the HIPPO, it's an acronym we use for the highest paid person's opinion, whether just somebody said, you've got to build this feature, you've got to go do this thing, right? Or you've got to go provide this service. When you start instituting this process, you start getting very clear ROI. And what you learn is that almost nothing that we do works. I shouldn't say almost nothing. It's about 10% of the time when you have a good team and when you have a good starting point. And so sometimes I actually start this process with teams, not with anything behavioral at all, but just saying, let's institute good measurement. Let's make sure that we're rigorously measuring using an A/B test, using a randomized control trial, which is the broader version of an A/B test. And that opens people's eyes to the need for change in their own teams to be more effective, to think through more of the user need and what they're trying to accomplish as part of the project, right? And so another way that we can apply this is to better understand ourselves, right? To understand our motivations, our actions, our intention-action gaps on a team, whether that is studying a new technique, right? Keep saying that, yeah, we're going to do this, and we don't do it, what's going on? It's not necessarily that people are insincere or that they're lazy, etc. It's probably that they're human and that one of these obstacles that we've talked about gets in the way. Inattention or distraction by other things. Netflix always being my favorite. Emotional reaction like, oh, that makes me, oh no, there's something about this I really don't like. And you can dig into that and you can help unpack that and be more effective. There's a wonderful body of literature in behavioral science specifically about group decision-making and how group decisions often can feel good. Now, this isn't when you're in a non-contentious environment, and ultimately are short-sighted, and are bad decisions. And we also see this in a contentious environment where we break up into different groups, and those groups become antagonistic and they become political. And either way, they just don't make a clear decision. And so this is a great resource. Russo and Schumacher is my favorite book, favorite authors in this field. So you can check out them. We can also look, so diversity and inclusion is a big issue in the US right now. I wish that it had been an issue for a long time, but at least now we're starting to pay attention. Whether that is the fair treatment of women in the workplace, whether that is the treatment of ethnic minorities. And there's a literature specifically about what works in that interpersonal context to hire more fairly, to, thank you, Scott, to hire more fairly, to treat people well. Scott's comment was a group split would never happen in the UK. And Ellie's comment was, you just threaten to tell on people. Hey, that works. There's also literature, and this gets back to what we were talking about before, specifically on behavioral science of ethics. What we find is that ethical behavior is contextual, just like everything else. We have an intention-action gap. We have good, thoughtful people who mean to do right by their designs, do right by their product, but they just kind of stray. They don't quite follow that path. And Dan Ariely, for example, has a great book on this, of his research and others in the field, as does the journalist Kwame Appiah. What we find is that we can apply the same techniques. We can look and see, well, where are people fudging things? Where are they lying to themselves about the ethical value of this action? How are they justifying it by saying that they're helping their teammates, for example? And how can we intervene? By clear, bright lines, by publishing guidelines, by setting up feedback loops, by setting social commitments, etc. Some of the things we were talking about before. We can apply these techniques on ourselves to help us stay on the straight and narrow. Not because we're bad people, but because we're people. And thus we all suffer from this. And so if we take a step back from the talk, I just wanted to summarize very quickly. And we see that in every domain of people's lives, there's often a gap between our intentions and our actions, whether that's our users using our products, whether that's our teammates trying to thoughtfully build their products, or whether that's our kids, whether that's ourselves. And there are companies all around the world now, rapidly over the last few years, who have started to apply this understanding to help their users, to help their employees, to help others do better. We have an understanding of what those obstacles are that allow us to really dig in to the context and see what's going on in a particular moment. And we have surprising and exciting range of tools that can help people do better, from the fun to the mundane, right? The fun being this visualization of the self, the mundane just being try contacting people at another time, right? And we see that there are other benefits to this for a team as well. Getting a rigorous sense of ROI, of the return on investment and what's happening in your product. And there's other literature that might be useful for you in your work. For example, Winning Decisions is a great book by Russo and Schumacher, as well as the writing on ethics by Dan Ariely, Kwame Appiah, and others. This is in many ways just a teaser, because this field is massive and exploding with innovation. So much new work all the time. I have a summary of this, both in the workbook and kind of how you do this stuff in a practical way, in the blueprint we've come to, as well as in the resource section, where you can learn more about this exciting field. And that's all I got. I know we've had some questions thus far, but I'm very happy if folks are still around to answer any other questions you might have. And that's the show, folks.
That's great. Yeah, really good. Really enjoyed that. Fascinating stuff. Yeah, we've still got time for questions. So anybody's got any, feel free. It's a nice size group, so if you want to unmute and ask, you're welcome.
Sure, yeah, just to unmute, ask directly. That's easy. Yeah. Monica, thanks for sending out the link to Dan Ariely's book. Yep. Oh, that is the podcast, right, of him talking about it. I would also suggest the book. It is excellent. It is, as far as I can tell, his least popular, but socially his most important one. It's really great work. As people are unmuting, I will read a few. So, how do we use this to build a better post-COVID world? We do it in the small. The challenges before us are great and they're multifaceted, and there are no broad solutions. and that's disappointing, and it's also true. And so what we look to are, what are the specific problems that we want to address? How do we want to build financial resiliency, for example, that we've seen the fact that people don't have any savings. And when they're unemployed, at least in the US, you guys actually have a social safety net. In the US, there's tremendous pain and suffering because of that. And so that's a particular problem we can solve, or we look at exercise, or we look at climate change, or we look at racial equity and wealth inequality. We look at specific problems and we dig in and we apply this process to solve that. That's how I approach it. Karshita said, you have the Kindle book, how can you get the workbook? Great. So, well, the Kindle book, I don't know, were you one of the early reviewers? I sent that out free to some folks.
No, it's, we'll share around the details for things.
Yeah. So the workbook itself, yeah. I will actually just type that here so you all can see it, but it's behavioraltechnology.co. And also, if you want to reach out to me, you can find me at behavioraltechnology.co. I'm Steve, Behavioral Technology, and there's also a contact form there. If you'd like to give me lots of money, there's an easy way you can do that there. Oh, sorry, I meant if you'd like a educational training program for your company. I confuse the two in my head. You can find that on the site as well. So, other questions people have?
Any more questions, folks? Don't be shy.
Yeah, I've got one there, Sat.
Bring it on.
It's about, I mean, how much of this is it possible to actually bring into day-to-day life? So, you know, when you're making decision-making in the moment, does it fundamentally slow you down? So walking past the coffee shop, you know, this smell's being put through the air to induce me to come in.
Right.
Does your life become less colourful because you find yourself analysing everything and am I being nudged? Am I being sludged?
Great. That's a great question. So the solution isn't always to slow down and think deliberatively. The mind has shortcuts because we are limited beings. We simply cannot think about everything. That's not possible. So that's not a route we can take as a society. Instead, what we look for are better shortcuts. Shortcuts that avoid the places that our existing shortcuts go awry. And so, for example, create. That funnel that I showed you, cue, reaction, evaluation, ability, timing, experience. When you first do it, it takes work. It takes conscious effort, right? You have to write out, okay, so what is the cue, what is the reaction, etc. After you've done it a number of times, it becomes a simple checklist. First on paper and then in your head. It becomes a habit of the mind. A way of breaking out of the obvious and think, okay, did I think about the cue, the reaction, value? Oh, yeah, okay, great. Well, yeah, this person clearly they've been burned before. And so it guides your mind very quickly into a different shortcut. Does that make sense? But there are some cases where we absolutely want to slow people down, like on our website, because we had a 500% lift. That was awesome. It was Leon's test. It wasn't mine. But he thought of it. He was great. There's sometimes where that's very effective. It's just, there's a reason we have shortcuts. We cannot slow people down and have them think carefully about everything, or they'll just stop listening.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions?
So when you were saying they're slowing down, and I immediately thought of all those e-commerce sites that do a brilliant job of hiding the sign out call to action from
you. Oh
yeah.
And yeah, we call that a roach motel.
Trying to find Amazon being a perfect example, and you can't. Yeah. There is no escape.
Yep. So there's a site called Dark Patterns by Harry Brignol that categorizes and publicly shames sites like these. And Amazon is high on the list. There are techniques like the roach motel, you can enter but you can never leave, right? Which is what you're talking about for Amazon. There's Zuckering, which is the various tricks companies use to steal your personal information or to have you choose to give it to others, etc. So, and you'll see that Brignol's work is great. He's actually cited by the US Congress in some legislation that's believe it or not, bipartisan legislation to try and crack down on some of this crap.
Nice.
Steve, what's your favourite piece of behavioural change you've been involved in?
Well, there's one I ran with this large minimum wage employer. where they were, so I work primarily in finance, right, and financial behavior. And we wanted to help people not pay bank fees. So in the US, at least, for minimum wage folks, they spend a tremendous amount of money on ATM fees, on withdrawing money from a different bank and what are called foreign ATM fees, et cetera. Anyway, they lose a lot of money on fees. And so we had a little competition within our company of who could come up with the best idea. Let me just say, I was pretty far down on the list. I did not win. It was actually somebody in our customer support side who knew our customers and really kind of understood what was going on in their lives. And the winning one was a picture of an ATM, a money machine, visibly eating your money and taking it away from you. So it was using vividness and loss aversion in this case. That we sent a single email to people and we randomly assigned it to, this is a huge population we were testing, that versus all the other ideas, mine, which lost, and everybody else's ideas, which lost, right? That single email saved people 1 day's wages a month. It was bloody awesome. So that's one.
That's pretty
And
amazing.
this is what we find, is that most of what we do, and I don't mean behavioral, but when we measure our product efforts, most of what we do has little marginal effect. And that's because you start with a team, right? They've already been doing stuff. Marginal efforts are very hard. But when you do them, God, they're great. That's behavioral science in a nutshell. That's applied work. So.
I had asked earlier about the language. Steve, you're going to touch on that?
Oh, yeah, sure. So many of these are examples of language. So, for example, loss aversion is fundamentally about the language you use. Now, in this particular example, we used visual version. But for example, if I said, so you are receiving $1,000 in your paycheck, and the ATMs are taking away $200 of it every month. It's actually, to be real, it's about $50 per 1,000 is how much people were losing, which is quite a lot, right? 5% of their money they were losing. Versus, that's a loss aversion frame, right? Versus you spend about $50 out of 1,000 on ATM fees.
Yeah.
That is a more neutral frame.
Yeah.
How we think about it matters. So that's one of the many examples. And as you look through the framing of choices, a lot of it comes down to the language choice. So for example, free is a particularly powerful word, and people are much more likely to take something that's free than something that they had to spend 1 cent for, assuming the frictions of actually having the money available, et cetera, were taken care of, right? And that's because free just feels special at an emotional level that is different than the cost and benefits of the action. And so if you look at those who might, for example, be pack rats, I happen to know a few in my life, if they get something for free, they will, by God, take it and store it and use it keep it for the rest of their lives, even though they never use it. The actual cost is massive, especially those around whom have to deal with it. But the benefit, the language choice matters so much here. So I see one experiment. Yeah, sorry. I hope that helped, Liz.
Perfect. Yeah.
Cool. Anything else? Bring it on.
Yeah, we've got time, guys. Keep them coming.
Okay, we got, so I tried to give some examples, by the way, from project management and from working with teams. Was any of that at all relevant for what you're doing? Yeah, I thought it'd be useful to ask.
Would be for this group, yeah, definitely.
Okay. Cool. So we actually do this in our work as well. So we do internal consulting on decision-making process at our company. So, but it's not usually what I talk about, so it was a little more rough. Just curious if it helped.
No, definitely. I would have thought so. Yeah, because a
Okay.
lot of the community, so a lot of us are in sort of technology roles or working in organisations that are perhaps, you know, delivering digital product, or financial product, or even working in teams. A lot of our sort of community are in the agile sort of space. So, you know, all this stuff's quite pertinent and relevant. So that's cool.
Cool.
Sorry,
Okay.
Scott, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say, I think in Agile we tend to use, especially in things like Scrum, we tend to use rules that drive behavior. They get kind of predictable behavior. So if we force you to have a retrospective, you'll think about, you'll go through the kind of questioning bit. If we force you to do planning, you'll go through the design bit.
So
yeah.
How's that forcing work? Do people generally do it thoughtfully and correctly?
What happens is eventually it becomes muscle memory, right?
Yeah.
And then people just do it because it's like, the elephant in the path thing.
Mm-hmm.
But initially, people don't like that forcing at all.
Yeah, indeed. So in my work, I don't look to coercion or forcing at all, right? And there are contexts in which it makes a lot of sense. It's just not not a part of my work. Hello, cat. And now there's a very loud cat here. Excuse me.
Actually, that element of Agile I've always felt uncomfortable with. The fact that we do coerce so much behavior.
Yeah.
That's
Anyway.
the thing. You should make it, you need to show the people what's the benefit of doing it. So yeah, Agile says do the retrospective at the end of every iteration to make it easy for people to know there is a time and place, but they need to see benefit in it. If they just show up, they hate it. If they see a reason why they are showing up and what's the benefit and that something will improve, then the feeling is different.
We've still got too many 15-minute stand-up Nazis about. You took 15 minutes. Your stand-up wasn't legitimate.
Yeah, I've known a lot of folks who end up sadly hating, and it is the word Anna used, hating Agile, because they feel it's a process put upon them and they don't buy in. And so they get the muscle memory, they do it, but it's fake. We call it actually Wagile, which is waterfall Agile, which is you're taking to every 2 weeks, you're doing the thing, but in your heads, you're really like, okay, I got to translate this big plan I have, like what I'm actually trying to do, to the language that these folks need. Fine, okay, can I just get back to my work, please? So, but maybe that's because we're Americans and we're just persnickety. But that's, yeah. Maybe y'all are great. I fully assume that every other culture in the world is just perfect.
Then all other Agile coaches would be out of work. So yeah, no.
So Tom asked, are people scared to talk to you at parties? I don't know. I don't get invited to parties.
I think that is arguably, well, not even arguably, easily the best question of the night.
I think it's
I
great.
just know if you were speaking to a behavioural scientist, you'd be watching your behaviour and thinking, why is he saying that? Why is he asking me that?
I know. No, people do that, and then they eventually just the ones who are sensitive about it, I just avoid them, and then the other folks, we have a grand time. So
That question reminded me of a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy with the probability drive that was invented by scientists that didn't get invited to parties.
So how long does it take for behavior to change? It depends on the behavior and depends on the type of behavior. So if it is an opt-in, for example, fractions of a second, right? Because it is a momentary single action and it is highly susceptible to the framing and the language used, right? If it is smoking, quite a long time, because well, not necessarily. It depends on how well you've identified the underlying habit and how well you can disrupt the cue that is triggering that, right? So for many people, it might be a particular time. Oh, this is the time I go smoke. Or they see other people going out the door and they go with them to go smoke, right? And so to disrupt can be quick. To change, to form a new habit, takes repetition in a stable context. And there's a myth out there that it takes 21 days. It's a myth, it's crap. It really depends on the stability of the context. A habit can form very quickly if you repeat it again and again. In fact, you can do this with like knitting, for example. Your mind can learn how to do a particular motion if you just do it again and again and again, where you may never do that on evaluating in a mortgage, because it's something you do in different contexts. You only do it a few times, and it is widely spaced and irregular. So depends on the context. In other words, like a lot of things in behavioral science, I ain't got any easy answers for you. Sorry. But buy the book, by the way. That has easy answers. No. It just has a more complex version of the not so easy answer. So there you go. All right, I think I get the sense we're probably wrapping up on questions. We don't need to belabor it. I thank you all for your time. I do hope to come visit Edinburgh again sometime.
Please.
I do. You may see a little bit of the Scottish red in my goatee there. Part of my ancestry is Scottish, and I'd love to come back sometime. So
Great.
pleasure talking with you all and hearing my great grandparents' accent.
Excellent. Great stuff.
That was brilliant, Steve. Thank you for that. No, I thoroughly
Cool.
enjoyed it. Really good content, really thought provoking, and I think everybody got a lot out of it. And you can tell that by the level of engagement we had. So no, thanks to you for sharing that. And I will share around, you know, the links to your various things. And everybody's giving you virtual applauses, but I think I'm unmuted.
Cool.
Obviously,
Thank you all.
you can hear me, so there we are. So no, I'm delighted. Hope you will come to Edinburgh and Scotland and tour around once this lockdown stuff passes. And who knows, maybe we'll
Indeed.
catch up for a beer sometime. But no, thanks again.
As
Really
my
enjoyed
mother would say, warms the cockles of my heart.
it. Love it.
She actually did say that all the
I'm
time.
sure she did. The cracking phrase it is too. And thanks to everybody for joining tonight. Really good participation. Excellent. These events
all.
would not be the same without your participation. So thank you. Just a couple of quick shout outs. Usual. We've had a really amazing bumper month actually. July, and we've got our final session number 5 next week with Karen Ferris, who's joining us from Australia. She'll be talking about resilience in the workplace. So another excellent session for you all. So do please join that if that's of interest. And then we've got a whole heap of stuff coming up in August. I think we start with Finn Goulden. We'll be talking about stuff coming up in his new book and his new work on lighthouse thinking. So that should be really good. So hopefully you'll all join that. Steve's dropped off. Great. And yeah, thanks again for joining. And hopefully we'll see you again. Take care. And yeah, all the best.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. It was great.